Good morning and afternoon for some of you. Welcome to How to Manage Product Development Expectations to be part of the 50% That Succeed webinar. We've got two standout panelists here to lead us through the discussion today. Scott Williams, the
Hello.
Director of Software Development at Tallwave, and Ed Borromeo. He's the Chief Operating Officer at Tallwave.
Hey guys.
And, today we're going to talk about just how to vet product development teams, and then provide some helpful tactics for creating a game plan, and then how best to optimize your team, and kind of what to expect, and then pitfalls to avoid that can often lead to product failure. And then keep in mind this is a very interactive webinar, so if you've got any questions, please feel free to chat or post them in the chat box, and we'll be sure to get to them. So I've given people just kind of a brief background of you guys, but if you want to just tell us a little bit more about what your roles are here at Tallwave.
Sure. We'll let Scott start.
Okay. Yeah, like Beth said, I manage all of the software operations that go on at Tallwave. Basically, what that boils down to is building and shipping great stuff. We work on iOS, we work on Android, we work on the web, and everywhere in between. For small little two-man startups to giant Fortune 500 companies.
That's a great description, man.
Thanks.
So my job is to give Scott whatever he needs at the end of the day.
I'm going to write that down.
To be able to ship great products. I'm the Chief Operating Officer, so it's just running the day-to-day of the business, and really it's about a roadblock remover. And ensure that everyone's enabled and has the resources necessary to do their jobs and deliver value to our clients. So that's my primary role.
Roadblock remover is no
right.
easy feat. Well, to kind of kick things off, I guess starting from the beginning, once you have an idea for an app or a piece of technology that you want to build, at what point do you seek out a product development team?
So let's see. I'll take a first stab at this one. I'd say if you've got an idea, you've been mulling over it. I always think there's benefit to just seeking out some advice immediately, right? Of what it would take to make this a reality. That doesn't preclude things like seeking out market viability and things like that, which from a business standpoint I think is quite important. But really understanding now, beyond those things, what does it take to make it real? What type of capital is required to make those things real? Whether you're doing that with your own in-house personnel, if assuming you have in-house personnel, or whether you have to bring in some outside help. But I don't think it's ever too early, really testing the waters with that.
Yeah, especially if you don't have any actual product experience before. If this is just an idea that came to you in the shower, then you're going to want to talk to someone who's been around the block a few times. It's real easy to get way ahead of where you think you need to be. If you're planning years out in the future with your idea, then you're probably going a little too far ahead. But also at the same time, you could just be spinning your wheels and focusing on the little minutia. So figuring out that game plan is really important.
Yeah, and then when do you go in-house if you do have a team versus seeking an outside team?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. I've actually done both myself and a couple other businesses, but I think there's lots of ways to think about it, and probably from your standpoint, Scott, you probably have some sort of different parameters as well. There's obvious things like size and scale of your company, whether you already have in-house personnel, the budget that you have, the bandwidth of your team. Things like that are the obvious things to assess whether you're insourcing or outsourcing. I think one of the things that for a lot of the clients that we have is we think about, are we producing net new solutions? Are we solving a really complex problem that could require a SWAT team to come in potentially to help? Or do we just need some fresh eyes? I think it's useful to have an outsider kind of kick the tires with you and really be a partner in that, whether you go with them fully or not. But for things that are generally more steady state or more maintenance mode or minor enhancements, I think it's great to have an in-house team do those types of things, and you ought to do it. You really ought to insource those sort of core maintenance, support, enhancement, and core things. Is my sense. What are your
and especially if you are venturing kind of in uncharted territory too. Like if you have a web product or something and you've heard about this crazy thing called mobile, perhaps you heard of it, that's kind of taken off a little bit in the last couple of years. People think it might really make it, and you want to get into that, but you have no idea. Like, what do we start? Like, where do you even start? Then, by all means, find someone who's built a dozen mobile apps, who knows the stack top to bottom, knows every single step on the way, and has been there and like done all the hard stuff before. And then further, like, you got to understand exactly what you're selling. Are you selling a mobile app? Are you selling a web service? Or are you selling the actual utility behind that? Like, what's the core of your product for there? And you need to own that core of that product. You might partner with someone to build out at first, but you need to be ultimately responsible for that. A great example is Periscope. Have you heard of Periscope, the live streaming company that Twitter has? It's pretty cool. When they started out, they understood that what they were selling was the ability, not an app, but the ability to stream live video from your phone. So they built that video service from the ground up. So they know every last little detail of how that thing works. They know where the problem points are. They know how to scale it. They know how to do everything with it. And they wouldn't have that ability if they just went and bought something off the shelf for that.
Oh, that's so interesting. And then if you do go outside, is it kind of understood that I think a lot of people have fear about bringing an idea to an outside team for fear that they might take it, but is it understood that, I mean, do you have the NDAs in place and everything like that?
Yeah, I mean, my personal philosophy, which may very well disagree with Ed, is that ideas just on their own are kind of worthless. Unimplemented ideas you don't get very far with, right? It's all kind of in the execution and how that goes. So even if you have an NDA, that's not preventing anyone really from running with it or doing something.
Dream crusher.
Yeah,
No, I don't totally disagree with that. I think what I tell people is that it's okay to, I think, because I'm an operator, I always feel like execution is often where people and teams stumble. So, you know, it's not, I don't think we depart in that viewpoint really, Scott. I think recently we had, and they're not a client of ours, but they did exactly what we just talked about, where they have an idea for an app and they don't exactly know what to do next. Now, they're successful business people in a different domain, right? They're very, very successful, hugely. And it'd be wonderful to be associated with them. But they do have a fantastic technological idea, but they didn't exactly know where to start. So they're doing the right thing by just talking to product and brand teams like us and many others, and we even suggested some other people to talk to just so they can get their arms around it. But they did ask me that very question. In fact, they said, hey, you know, we know the tech lead at this Fortune 2000 company, and we'd love to run an idea by him or her. That we could be a future acquisition target, and or, you know, they're obviously skilled in their craft, and so we'd love their idea. It's like, but is that an issue? Should I be concerned? Now, I get there's mutual NDAs and there's things like that, but at the end of the day, you know, my comment to them was like, no, it isn't a concern, because it's all about execution, right? If you're talking to giant enterprises, I mean, generally some of those enterprises have a process to move on new ideas, and so it's not, their life cycle is going to be quite long anyways. And if we're talking to earlier ventures, I mean, at the end of the day, it's the same. It's about execution. And if you can't execute on a brilliant idea, there's 1,000 great ideas outside these four walls right now. If you can't execute on it, it goes nowhere.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Well said. Well said. So, as the manager, either funding or leading the project, what should they look for in a product development team? What are some of maybe the qualifying questions to vet potential teams or candidates?
Yeah, I'll give you my view on this, Scott. If you have anything, you know, I think there's obviously the standards. You know, Scott sort of mentioned it, like, you know, how many. We recently brought in some partners for a particular build that we don't necessarily seek to do ourselves, but it's great to see their portfolio of, you know, hundreds and hundreds of applications, both web and mobile, that they've built, right? And those that are obviously willing to put a reference forth and see the body of work. So there's the standard things like, you know, what's the track record, what's the history, what's the nature of their clients, the sort of size and scale of projects, the size and scale of timelines and things like that frankly, are standard. I think some of the things that I like to look into when we're evaluating product dev partners and or really even staff for us is what's their sort of demeanor, what's their communication sort of MO, right? How do they manage timeline crunches? Tell me a story about tough timelines. And the reason is, as funding managers, as division leads, as folks that are sort of have ownership of a project, you're going to be subject to that, either through your own passion or deadlines from your investor, or from your CEO, or from your CTO. Things will drive that, and so you want to know how they behave in that environment, how they react to it.
I want to know also that. Like when something just totally out of the blue, unexpected happens, like how do you recover? For something recoverable, because there's of course some things that, sorry, there's just something catastrophic happens, but there's a lot, like you're going to run into issues, right? Just about any significant project that you've got to overcome, and how do you do that?
I'd also ask them to kind of explain how they manage conflicts and competing priorities. Like, hey, it's going to happen. So how do we do that? And I think another thing, and this is really along the lines of our practice, is how are they taking the users of the end game into consideration, right? The end user and the business. At the end of the day, it's is that even part of their language? Is that part of their lexicon of understanding that, hey, this isn't just we're not just a production element that's just producing stuff based on a blueprint or spec, but there is in fact a business impetus for this, and there are in fact users that we empathize with that will use this, and I've got to create the best thing out there for them. And so I think the best partners we've seen have a great consideration for the business. The users are wonderful at managing and pragmatic at managing timelines, requirements, and have a way of being transparently communicating to manage priorities. So that's I get down beyond sort of the standard qualifications, like how are these people out in actual production time.
And like what I look for too is, what do you have that's beyond just like the ability to turn a wrench, so to speak. If I'm building, say, an iOS app, I would expect like a good team to be able to say, oh, you've designed this screen. This is going to get you rejected by Apple. That means you're not going to be able to get this, actually ship this. So by all means, tell me that before we get that rejection and waste 2 weeks trying to fix it or something like that. So what do you do beyond just actually typing out the code?
No, that's a great point. And what you were talking about earlier too, you don't want to work with a team that's just going to take your money. You want to know that they've got the end user's kind of best interest at heart.
Yeah, absolutely. Are you thinking about the product, or are you thinking about just the work?
Yeah.
You got it.
So often product builds they'll be delivered in phases. So what should you expect out of an initial scope of work?
Yeah, that kind of gets into the whole issue with planning. And there is such a thing as doing too much planning up front. If you build this gigantic scope, like put together documentation that's like that thick in a binder, or 2 binders sometimes, then there's that curveball thing again. That's probably going to change. Something's going to happen, and did you just waste a month of work gathering requirements and typing out hundreds of pages? And of course, the opposite's true too. If you do too little planning, then you're just going to be wandering around, not even sure what to do instead. I mean, so it's kind of an art, really, to get the right kind of baby bear-sized planning that you want to do.
Well, so I look at it 2 ways as sort of a high level. On one hand, that initial scope ought to be for the product. The product to be tangible, that initial scope ought to be something that accomplishes 2 things. It drives sort of the main metric or outcome for the business. What does that at a minimum level have to be? And obviously what the users, are you answering the problem for the users, right? And y'all know this, it's the minimum viable product piece. But one of our senior designers at a recent design studio we did for one of our partner clients talked about the minimum lovable product, right? And it's kind of changing the lexicon a little bit around what is the minimum that we have to build that not only achieves the business outcomes and metrics, but actually is sticky enough to earn the right and have the privilege to keep going our buyers, our consumers, our users, right?
Yeah, because I think viable is especially kind of this word that people throw around.
Sure.
But you don't know what it means. But, you know, if you love a product, and maybe that is little, you know, poofy language. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, you have stuff that you use every day that you love.
Yeah, it's a little fluffy, but I think what he was trying to get at was just that, you know, you like it enough, it's interesting, you want to keep going. You might want to even provide feedback, or, you know, you're delighted by the concept, and it's enough to sort of fulfill that and leave you wanting more. And so that allows us as a product team and the businesses to keep iterating on it, right? Okay.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, once you have kind of that idea of everything, then you can start breaking it down into smaller and smaller chunks. It's real easy to just kind of see something and think, oh yeah, 6 to 8 weeks is kind of the magic thing. If someone says 6 to 8 weeks, they probably don't know what they're talking about. That's a nice little cheat for everyone out there. So I mean, you move iteratively. I mean, good software is built iteratively, good products are built iteratively. So you've got that design prototype, test it out with real people, put it in front of a real honest to goodness person, not on your team, not who's too close to it, and see what they do. Then you'll find all sorts of stuff out from that. Understand what they're doing, what they're trying to accomplish, and then you have probably a really good idea of what you need to focus on first. You know, anything you need to fix, anything that needs to be tweaked, or things like that. Then you can kind of move on to the next step and start actually writing a few things down. You don't need to, again, don't need binders. Just start doing some small things like something we call storycarding, or something like a short document, usually that's technical in nature too.
I would just add to that in that, you know, Scott mentioned a number of sort of these iterative steps to get to the right answer, and you can literally scope around those things too. You don't have to say, okay, hey, it's going to be, you know, X amount, this whole shoot match. Like you can learn, and I mean, you know, I think certainly for our clients, we'll say, hey, here's what the range would be to bring something like this to market. Whether you're a mature company bringing a new product line into market or service line, or you're an early venture or seasoned business people that are bringing technology to the fore. So here's what that range would be. However, we can certainly scope on exactly what he just said. Hey, let's take the first cut at a prototype. Let's take the first cut at, you know, the story cards, and the first cut at the technical requirements, you know, guidelines, so to speak, and you could scope around each of those little things along the way. And it's just moving capital efficiently. I know it seems like, well, hey, doesn't that mean we're scoping every 4 to 6 weeks or so? Yes, the answer is yes. But you're going to know where you're going, and you're going to be assured along the way that, you know, we hit the right answer in this leg. Let's go hit the next right answer, right? It isn't just this big black box of gargantuan effort and scope. It's just consuming it one bite at a time.
So at what point can you kind of gauge, okay, this project is going to cost me X amount of dollars, or it's going to take this amount of time?
It's probably better to answer that.
Yeah. Once you start to have some of those assets, like you've broken down those features, then you can get a better idea of what that looks like in terms of cost. Like, so I mean, take, for example, I want my users to sign in with username and password. That sounds really simple. Everyone's done that before. You probably have hundreds of usernames and passwords, probably your email address, right? Mm-hmm. But you still got to build it. It's still something that needs to be done. So you can't just say, yeah, that'll take a day. But have you considered, well, the user has to sign up. You know, they have to create a username password. You have to check to see if that email's already been in the system or not. Are they signing up twice? Do you allow that? Do you not? What happens if they forget their password? You know, all these little things that on first blush you might not totally understand. And so you just keep breaking them down into smaller chunks until you really understand each of those. Because what might just be like, oh yeah, user sign-on takes a day, all of a sudden is everything we need for sign-on, that's going to take 3 days or a week or who knows how long, because now we actually understand all that's in there. You can go too far down that stack and really start saying, okay, well, a button that's below the form takes longer than a button that's to the right of the form. That's an implementation detail. You don't got to go down that low. Just as low enough that you feel you really understand kind of where things are at in terms of complexity.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And then what should you sort of expect out of your development team? Are there certain milestones you should be expecting from them along the way, or a way maybe that they should approach the project or anything like that?
So I think at a high level, whether it's internal or external, I think there's a standard. I'll tell you what I appreciate. I'll appreciate. I'm
going to take notes.
Yeah, you should take notes. Here's what I very much value. I value organization. I value having line of sight. Like here's the playing field. Here's what we prioritize. We're on top of it, and sort of this confidence of here's how the program is running to bring this thing to life. I value I think data-driven behavior, right? Like, hey, we're doing these things, and the sort of the demonstrative of the pragmatic approach to bringing a product to life. I certainly value a point of view, right? So say, hey, here's I'd want a product team, helping me understand all the risks of the landscape, as opposed to just saying, yep, this is what the spec says.
Yeah.
That's what I did, man. I did it.
Yeah.
I was like, wow, gosh, wish we were critically thinking throughout the whole way, right? And could have used your help on that. And I'm not implying that all people do that. I think that's a differentiator in great product dev teams versus others. And then I certainly, would expect, a perfect organization is sort of understanding the communication. Right? Communication is a big part of getting anything done. As you guys know, this isn't rocket science, and you can imagine how well certain application design and development jobs go versus not going very well, largely as a function of communication protocol and organization or lack thereof. Yeah. Right. And I think finally, I would also expect them to have an interest. Whether they do or not, I would take the time to explain to them the business outcome and remind them what this is for. I just always feel like that if team members know the business and sort of the underlying why we're doing what we're doing, that it just lends itself to people doing a better job. And a team willing to go do that and accept that education and be inquisitive about it, I think differentiates a team.
Yeah, you mentioned communication, I think, which is a huge one. Not just, and again, there's an art to it. Don't just bubble up every last little thing, because you're just going to flood someone with information that way. But what's critical? How do you deliver that? Is if you keep saying that the sky is falling, oh my God, we're late, we're going to be delayed every time, then that starts to become noise, and you lose that. And be honest, be upfront. Because I know a lot of developers especially can fall into the trap of, this isn't that bad, this isn't that bad, this isn't bad, oh my gosh, it's so bad, all of a sudden, and then you've got a month delay or something like that, or worse. But have some sort of process to kind of account for that. Like, if you have dependencies, then you need to be tracking if the first one of those slips, then all the other ones are probably going to slip too, and it might be a snowball effect, and the slippage gets worse and worse and worse as you go. Account for that. Then at that point, you need to talk with the client and then say, this is what's up, and then more importantly, this is what we're going to do to fix it, and this is what we're going to do to try to make sure it doesn't happen again. Sometimes you get those crazy things that just pop up and happen, but how do you recover? How do you roll with the punches?
Just on that note, as a client, or in terms of, I would certainly expect everything you just said from a product design and development group. I'd also expect, along the same lines of not just how you recover, but apart from the transparency, it would be, here's what happened, here's what we're faced against, here are the risks of the trenches along the way. If and when we cross that bridge, here are the options potentially that I'll be discussing with you, right? And I would love somebody on that side, if I was the business owner, or if I was the representative of the business deploying this product. I can't tell you how comforting it is to have someone on the other side of the table saying, hey, look, I understand this is the way it goes. This isn't, it can be rocky sometimes, or there could be ground with you, what have you. But here's how we're going to approach that. And when it does, I'm not just going to be like, It's the way it is. It's
Yeah.
gonna be like, this is how we're going to approach solving that. And, you know, ideally a team that brings forth options and solutions to mitigate risk, to still get you as close as possible to what your end game is.
I have an anecdote
Yeah.
for that. Yeah, for an iOS app we give. iOS is an easy example because you have to deal with Apple, and that's always got a whole bunch of hoops you got to jump through.
Sure.
We had a client, you probably remember them, from about a year ago, and one of the stakeholders in there is a celebrity, and so his appearance was in the screenshots for that. You know, his marketing, because he's an important piece of that app. And when you're submitting an iOS app to Apple, you go through this review process, and they check lots and lots of things. And one of those is that you aren't using marketing images that you shouldn't. So like, you can't just go and have like Tom Hanks promoting your app, just putting a picture of them with a fake quote. You can't do that. I don't know if you do that. No, yeah, you can't do that. No, not allowed. And so one of the times we submitted an update for their app, it came back as rejected, and saying that you can't use so-and-so's appearance without their permission. But it wasn't that bad, because although, yeah, those rejections are annoying, we had already prepped our client saying, this is how the App Store works. You go through this review process, you might get rejected. It's not the end of the world. Here's what you do. You either fix the problem, you can appeal it, and you know, they give them a whole host of options. So when that rejection did come in, we weren't expecting that particular one because everything was on the board, but it still happened, but it wasn't a disaster. You just send a letter in and then you're good.
Yeah. You mitigated that expectation beforehand.
Yeah, it's all setting expectations.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And that'll lead nicely into our next question, but we actually did get one in the chat.
Oh boy.
They wanted to know how challenging is it to develop a user website and mobile app simultaneously and share the data acquired from both?
Do they mean like what kind of data? Like how to, like the data in the app itself, like analytics type of data, or I'm not sure. That's a hard question.
If there are users using the website portion versus the mobile, is there a way to streamline the back end?
I mean,
Like purchasing data.
right. Yeah. I mean, any type of app that you build is probably gonna have data in there. And if they're talking about syncing, then that can be a whole can of worms to get into. I mean, how much time you got? You know, we can spend the next hour just talking about syncing data back and forth. I'd love it if we do that. No, he won't. That's a hard question, especially depending on the data and all the features. That's probably not something I can just answer right now. But if they want to talk, then I'd be happy to.
Okay, maybe.
I'll kind of take a stab at it.
Yeah.
So presumably, though, you know, you try to build centralized infrastructure, right, to tie to whether, you know, I don't know about the syncing piece, but presumably you're tying into some centralized infrastructure, whether that's the DB or whether that's things like that. I think from a design build standpoint, I think it can be done. You can be building, you know, both the web version of something as well as the mobile version of something. I think that from a design track standpoint, there's probably two. You have to take that into consideration, right? So, for example, if you're going in and you're saying, "Hey, I got to go build this thing when I want it to be on mobile," ultimately, you've got to consider that it's going to be ultimately mobile on the get-go, you know, not just a web app. And so that makes your designers more efficient. It allows them to start thinking about information architecture, and there's a way to sort of deploy those relatively simultaneously. And then from a build standpoint, I think those can be two separate simultaneous
Right.
efforts.
Yeah, and it comes down also to features and things like that too. I mean, do you want it to be like Google Docs, where as soon as you type one letter, it shows up on everyone else viewing the same document, kind of thing, or is it just more of like it shows up eventually or something like that? Figuring out exactly the requirements for that then lets you build the right kind of solution into that and digging in deep to that.
Maybe we can touch base offline with him on this. It looked like he was kind of interested more in the syncing in the real time. And
okay, yeah, and there's different options you can do. I mean, if it's if it's the core thing, then you probably need to build a custom solution. If it's not, then you can look at something like, say, like just even a Firebase type of product that can handle some of that stuff built in right out of the box.
Yeah, makes sense. So jumping back to our kind of our conversation, or this kind of dovetails nicely with it, but can you talk to us a little bit about story carding and how you should prepare for a story carding exercise? Because I think that can, like we were talking about, mitigating some of the concerns, or also kind of unveiling any problems or hiccups that might come up along the way.
Yeah, story carding, if done right, can be very useful. And it's just kind of that process. You'd have that complex thing. You have that that you can. It's just a fancy way of naming a feature as a story. And if you really kind of want to get into it, they always take the grammar of as a something I want to do something so that I can accomplish some goal. So as a user, I want to add a product to my shopping cart so that I can buy it. And that's at a high level, but when you have something like that, if you want to keep up with that story metaphor, like for probably too long, that might be considered what's called an epic story, like of Homer or something like that. Sorry to bring up sophomore lit again. And yeah, that's something that you just can't scope in your head. You just cannot come up with an accurate number for that. So you need to break it down a little bit further. So if you want to stick with a shopping cart, say as a user, I want to be able to adjust the quantity of something in my shopping cart. And then, maybe that's a little bit more obvious like that. If you break it down further, you need to say, I need to prevent a user from adding negative items to a shopping cart if that's something that they can do, because that's the data validation problem. So you have complex features, you break them down into simpler ones. There's some other methodologies that you can go into for that. Some people get way more dogmatic about it than others. I tend to avoid dogmatism or dogma in the stuff we do, just because it usually only produces fights from that. So you might assign some sort of complexity value, whether that's some point system, whether I've seen t-shirt sizing, like small, medium, large, or something completely tailored. That just lets you identify and call out stuff that's too complex. And when something's too complex, then you break it down and break it down and break it down. But you don't have to get it down all the way to the silly level, just so enough that you really understand what you're doing. Then when you're done, you might have upwards of anywhere from 100 to more. If you got too much more than that, you might be doing too much at once, and break it down maybe into like a V1, V2, or something like that. But then when you have that, then you have a whole bunch of all your features. You can then prioritize them. Be like, oh, we really need this, we really need this. Oh, this is a lot more complex than I thought. Maybe we can defer that, or we don't really need that, or something like along those lines. Does that all make sense?
So I'll just add to that real quick on terms of what to expect from it. Obviously, it's sort of the body of work of what the initial look would look like, and potentially, perhaps all the other sort of features and functions, stories that we perhaps want, perhaps it may not be in the first version, but that just lends itself to really begin your backlog, your roadmap, and then obviously getting into. I'd also recommend that as you build that there's some user testing along there, just to make sure that how do you prioritize that? Well, ideally you have some user data that helps you with that.
That actually feeds nicely. We got a really great question in the chat. How can you help a product team be more effective in influencing the client to do more testing with real users versus trying to adjust features or create new features?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a good question.
Yeah, I mean that comes from the validation. I mean, especially you should be recording those and seeing that. So if someone types up, the users are struggling finding out where to change the color to pink because they really like pink. Well, then you have data for that because you have 5 users all trying to find out where the stupid color palette is, or something like that.
Yeah, so I think I look at this in 2 ways, and I think the argument typically is, so I'll just, I don't exactly, hopefully I'm pointing this in the right direction, but I'll kind of tell you what I think I know. And always believe. So we always make we're always of the position that obviously you want to user test, and a week or 2 of moderated testing or some sort of needs validation or what have you is critically important to not incur code debt on a future basis. But we also are of the belief that the ground can't be moving beneath you, and people are just sort of changing things along the way. That perhaps in order not to have to rework that or to ensure that we're making the right investment, I always bring it back to the business, and to appeal to my clients and also to just the business people, right? It's the right thing to do to know that you're spending as capital efficiently as possible. That let's go put stuff in front of users that they've actually asked for, or actually want, that's also solving their problem. And so there's a way to do that at a relatively nominal investment throughout design and development, not just on the front end. And I think just continually reiterating how important that is to save rework in the future and therefore investment is key, right? And so now that ought not to be disruptive to the current process. So for example, you're going down the path, you've got some releases and sprints, they can be changing things real time. Cool, hey, we can put different options in that, but let's also have sort of another work stream going in parallel where we can quickly test that. There's lightweight ways to test beyond, probably the deepest way is like first-hand research, moderated testing, and then there's obviously lighter ways to test from more of a survey or quick hit, 5-second test, things like that. Basis. But at the end of the day, it comes down to timeline and budget and future rework and the incurred debt you'll acquire should you just be building a product on, as a function of you liking it that way.
Yeah.
Of your gut.
Yeah.
Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, that great response is obviously very critical to test early on. And then we actually did get one other question about the story carding. So they wanted to know if story carding or storyboarding, is it done after the wireframes? He just said, personally, it seems easier to visualize features than telling the story. So are there certain tools to use for both to communicate the features?
Yeah, that's a great question. We generally do it after there's some sort of visual component, whether that's more high-level designs or wireframes, or sometimes even just sketches will work, especially if you're already familiar with a product, then you really don't need hi-fi visual design. But as long as people can visualize things, then they usually get much more productive conversations out of that.
Story card, you mean?
Yeah, story carding. Yeah. In terms of tools, we've tried a few. I keep coming back to Trello, though. It's I don't love Trello, but I find it still pretty darn useful for story carding because it's fast. If you're fiddling around with an app or with something, then you're wasting time when you're story carding because you got to keep typing, getting it out there, getting it on the paper. You're making a rough draft, not a novel here, is what you're doing. So Trello works really well for that, especially if you learn some of the shortcuts that comes with it.
And there are some story carding tools specifically out there, or user story type tools that are out there. You'll find them. They're sort of open source, free. I will just say that from just a comment on what you said, whether you need some visual. We do both here, and I'd recommend that. I would agree that it makes story carding more useful and more meaningful. Conversation can come out of it with some sort of visual reference, but I would not recommend investing, let's bang out all the wires or, to make this thing happen. Like as he said, because typically what I've seen done, and we also do it here, is we concept at a high level, we pen sketch, we may have some early wires of the core loops of the application. Right around that time is enough visual reference and enough ideation that has occurred with the client or all stakeholders around the table where when we can move into story carding, that's a good reference, and then we can build upon that, build up the balance of the stories.
And we may have already kind of addressed this just talking about story carding and wireframes, but often projects will appear very straightforward, kind of going back to your simple like username and password login, but then under the hood it's actually much more complex. Are there approaches that you can take to kind of avoid some of these surprises?
Yeah, and that just kind of reiterates some of the importance of story carding that's in there. Or if there's another process that you use, then that's great. I mean, the whole point of agility is to optimize for future speed. And for that, so identifying what's complex, because every project worth doing is going to have some complexity in it, and you need to break that down. Otherwise, you're just not going to know how long it'll take. And everyone's got a timeline of something. Everyone's got a date that needs to be hit in some form or fashion. So being able, there's always that iceberg metaphor where you see that top whatever it is, 5-10%, but there's something that could potentially sink you just right below it. So getting down as much as you can, and being able to deal with the curveballs that come your way. Because even if you've perfectly story carded something, there still might be something that comes up in there. Back when I was building more and more apps, we encountered something weird way late in the process, whereas the production version of something kept crashing, but that crash just was not reproducible in the development environment. So those bugs are awful, because it's a lot harder to debug something in the production environment than it is in development environment. And so that took I think 2.5 days just to identify where it was. It was a ridiculously simple fix. It was deleting one word in the code to fix the bug.
That's always fun.
Yeah, it was great. I don't smoke, but I was really thinking about it at that point. But you know what? That's going to happen. No matter how talented your team is, something like that just might happen, and you got to be able to deal with that.
Yeah, in terms of to this point, you can do your best. You can story card the crap out of something and get to your gut feel of complexity. Once you're actually in, and actually, you're building it, you're going to run into something. And that, apart from underscoring the planning side of it in an agile fashion, as you mentioned, it really is about just surfacing it as quickly as possible and mitigating the risk, as we talked about. Like, hey, here's what we found. Here's how that changes it. And the good news is you're taking it in bite-sized chunks. So you're not you haven't overbuilt something at that point, and then only to realize that, gosh, this was harder than we thought. Now we have to re-engineer all this other stuff. Like, I'd also say that it also makes sense to often take down the most complex aspects of design or dev at first, because that's where you foresee what could potentially drive the critical path of bringing something to life. And so to the extent that the project allows tackling those things and getting early sights onto what it really takes by actually doing could be useful.
Especially if that's your core.
Yeah, especially if it's your core.
Yeah, then when you've got that, and say you finally get it and it's 6 weeks longer than you thought it would be, and you only have 3 weeks left, well then, hey, you've got the core, so what? But now we have 3 weeks. What do we get done in 3 weeks?
Exactly right. And you've already sort of taken care of the core, the complexity around that. So that's a great point.
Yeah.
So we've talked about some ways to kind of mitigate problems or anticipate them, but are there some tactics that you can implement for working with your product development team to kind of optimize them?
Feed them.
Or
Put some snacks underneath the.
There you go.
Those are good. Yeah.
He's like, those are good.
Wait, what time is this? Lunchtime?
Put a hand under the desk.
I mean, from the opposite end of thing, you can't be too overly simple with the product team, and especially if don't necessarily step on their toes, because they might be an expert in this one field, and you might have some understanding of it, but don't go and try to tell them exactly how to do their jobs, I guess, because then that's just going to introduce friction in the whole process. You should have a good understanding of what's going on, but don't make too many large assumptions about something too. Like if you say, well, it's only just something, then you might be oversimplifying it or not thinking too critically about it yourself.
Yeah, I'd also add, and it's along those same lines, but maybe at a high level, is out of my prod design and dev team, I'd want to be an active participant. I want to be present for them. To optimize their process, you want to be able to unblock them, right? And so if their domain is design and development and launching great products, and say mine as either the product owner or the business is the business and the resources, let me be the best at that, right? And so how do I unblock them? How do I keep them productive? What do I need to shore them up with to ensure they feel like they're in an environment to create amazing things? A couple other things is it's pretty disruptive if people like me are changing a bunch of things in real time. The design and dev teams will feel like the ground's moving beneath them, and it's both rattling and disruptive. And so I really have to control sort of how I deliver that message in the right venue and the right cadence, being respectful to the process, the creative process and the build process. So that's that, you know, it's like, it's just, I don't want to be disruptive to the process.
Imagine you're dumping a cup of water down onto a hill. That water is going to go everywhere. And so it's up to your turn. Your job is to make the rivers for that, dam it up where it needs to be, and have it flow in the right direction instead of everywhere. Because you can't stop it because it's going to go, but you can guide it and direct it and make it go the right way.
Absolutely. And the last thing I'll add to that is another sort of tactic or approach that I like to use, apart from respecting the process and being an active participant, doing the best I can in my role, is, you know, I have great faith in people, right? And so still believe that if you speak in terms of outcomes and you speak in terms of true needs of the problem that you're solving, and you give people the autonomy to figure out how to get there, and obviously with being explicit of communication, what is required, that allows a team to sort of be active participants in delivering not just a product with code behind it that's designed and beautiful, but really being active participants and providing value to the marketplace, right? And seeing the fruits of that labor come to life and people's delight, but then also in business success.
Yeah, and be flexible. I think it's one of life's ironies that the word agile has become this one single process that you absolutely have to do and do not stray from. I think one of the people who first kind of signed up with the Agile Manifesto kind of abandoned it shortly afterwards. It's just a matter of working with agility, is what he says now. And don't be so rigid that you have one process and you have to stick to it. If it's not working, change it. That doesn't mean you should throw out all the process, but your team is separate from all other teams, and you need to figure out what works best for them and enable them to be able to move quickly in an agile fashion, just with a lowercase a instead of the uppercase.
Yeah.
And to that end, that isn't new, right?
Yeah.
High performance teams in general, we all know this, right? Operate in that fashion, from, you know, firefighters in a 6-man squad to, you know, I only know this from some other careers that I've had in sort of that world. But
Arsonist.
High performance teams obviously have that sort of culture ingrained in there, and it's exactly that. It's just a matter of agility and pragmatism and working efficiently to understand the end game, right? So you know the end game and how efficiently can we get there, and take the egos out of it, put the transparency into it, get stuff done.
Yeah.
And that's exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right on.
Yeah, and I think kind of what you kicked it off with is like starting with why and making sure that that's always top of mind for the team.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So thank you guys. I think that wraps up our webinar today. Cool. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. And thank you guys for tuning in too. We will have a recap of this that we'll send out via email. We'll have an audio and the video version as well. And then we'll be back in January with another webinar on FinTech and kind of predictions for 2017. Nice. So be sure to join us then.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you guys.
Thanks, Beth.
Thanks, Beth.